the Dakota Territory, autumn of 1886. When Anders Larsen began digging the hole for his new cabin, his neighbors thought he had finally surrendered to the prairie madness. It was not the digging itself that caused the first murmurs of concern at the trading post, but the sheer, defiant scale of the excavation. While other men scraped just enough sod and topsoil to level a space for floor joists, Anders dug down. He dug until he was chest deep, then shoulder deep, then until his wife Alara had to pass him water on the end of a rope. The pile of dark earth beside the rectangular pit grew into a small hill, a monument to what everyone agreed was a profound waste of effort. Silas Croft, the man who had built nearly half the cabins in their small valley, stopped his wagon on the rutted track overlooking Anders's claim. He watched the quiet Norwegian, a man more accustomed to the sea than to soil, haul another bucket of dense clay from the pit. Croft shook his head, a slow, disappointed motion. He had seen men do strange things in the face of their first Dakota winter, but this was a new category of foolishness. He turned to his companion, a younger farmer named Jensen. "He's building his own grave," Croft said, his voice flat with certainty. "The frost will have that hole, and whatever he puts in it before the new year." What did this quiet, unassuming former shipwright understand about the physics of heat and cold that a generation of seasoned, hardened frontiersmen had simply missed? What secret was he burying in that impossibly deep hole? And why was he so willing to endure the ridicule of an entire community to protect it? The answer would not only change how they survived on the unforgiving prairie, it would redefine the very meaning of shelter. Before we uncover the principles behind Anders Larsen's radical design, take a moment to support our exploration of forgotten wisdom. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of practical genius. And in the comments below, let us know what part of the world you're watching from and what the winters are like where you live. We read every single comment. To understand the madness of Anders's method, you must first understand the brutal reality of a conventional cabin in the Dakota Territory. The standard dwelling was a testament to expediency, not comfort. It was a simple box of hewn logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, grass, and sometimes moss. The floor was typically rough-sawn planks laid over logs that rested directly on the leveled ground, creating a shallow, drafty crawl space. The roof was sod, heavy, and prone to leaking during the spring melt, but a decent insulator against the summer sun. The problem was winter. The enemy was not merely the cold, it was the wind. The prairie wind was a physical entity, a relentless thief that scoured the landscape for any pocket of warmth. It found every tiny gap in the chinking, every crack around the ill-fitting door and single-pane window. It flowed under the floorboards, carrying with it the deep, penetrating chill of the frozen earth. A family living in such a cabin did not live in a warm space. They lived in a small bubble of survivable heat generated by a constantly roaring fire. The cast-iron stove was the tyrannical heart of the home. It demanded a tithe of firewood that was staggering to comprehend. A single family might burn through 20, even 30 cords of wood in a single winter. This meant that a man's autumn was not spent preparing his fields for the next year, but in a desperate race against the first snowfall, felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking a literal wall of fuel. The wood was often green, unseasoned, because there was never enough time to let it dry properly. It burned inefficiently, producing more smoke and creosote than heat. Inside the cabin, life was stratified by temperature. Directly beside the stove, your skin would feel scorched. 10 feet away, you could see your breath. The walls were coated in a layer of frost that grew thicker with each passing week, a glittering, beautiful harbinger of misery. Water buckets froze solid overnight if left too far from the fire. Children were bundled in so many layers they could barely move, their faces chapped raw by the dry, smoky air. The floor was the coldest part of all, a sheet of ice-cold planks that leached warmth from the feet of anyone who dared to stand on it. To live in a prairie cabin was to be perpetually cold, perpetually tired from the labor of feeding the fire, and perpetually inhaling the fumes of its inefficient combustion. This was the problem Anders Larsen had endured for one winter, and had sworn he would never endure again. Anders was not a farmer. He had come to America with dreams of land, but his hands and his mind were shaped by a different trade. In his native Norway, he had been a shipwright's apprentice, then a journeyman, building fishing vessels meant to endure the brutal storms of the North Atlantic. He understood the integrity of a sealed hull. He understood how to fight, not just cold, but a damp, penetrating cold that sought to rot wood and chill a man to his very bones. He knew the value of a dead airspace, the insulating gap between an inner and outer hull that kept the hold from freezing and the crew's quarters from becoming coffins of ice. During his first terrible winter on the prairie, he had not just suffered, he had observed. He watched the way the wind sculpted the snow, piling it into deep drifts that he noticed acted as powerful insulators. He saw how the prairie dogs and foxes dug their burrows deep, escaping the surface cold for the stable, predictable temperatures of the deep earth, while his neighbors complained about the frost that crept 2, 3, even 4 feet into the ground. Anders saw it differently. He realized the frost was a shallow enemy. Below that line, the earth was not warm, but it was stable. It was a constant temperature, roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. It was a thermal anchor in a sea of volatility. His motivation was not abstract. It was the memory of his infant daughter, Carrie, her face blue with cold, even as she was swaddled in every blanket they owned. It was the image of his wife, Alara, her hands cracked and bleeding from constantly stoking the stove and melting snow for water. He was not trying to build a better cabin. He was trying to build a sanctuary. He was applying the logic of a ship's hull to a house on a frozen sea of grass. The earth would not be his enemy, something to be built upon. It would be his ally, a thermal shield he would wrap around his family. The construction began with that enormous pit. He dug until his shovel struck a layer of dense, unyielding clay nearly 7 feet below the surface grade. This was well below the 4-foot frost line that so plagued his neighbors. At the bottom of this trench, he did not lay logs. He laid a 6-inch bed of carefully sorted river gravel, creating a French drain that would channel any ground moisture away from his foundation. This was his first radical departure from convention. Everyone knew that water was the enemy of any foundation, and digging a hole this deep was, in their minds, simply inviting a flood. Upon this gravel bed, he began to build not one but 2 parallel foundation walls out of field stones scavenged from his land. The stones were massive, heavy, and irregular, and he spent weeks carefully fitting them together with a mortar of clay, sand, and a small amount of precious lime. The outer wall was thick, nearly 2 feet at its base, designed to hold back the immense pressure of the earth. The inner wall was slightly thinner, about 18 inches thick. Between these 2 stone walls, he maintained a precise, uniform gap. It was an 18-inch space of empty air. This was the feature that caused the most confusion and outright mockery. When Silas Croft saw the twin walls rising from the pit, he scoffed. "What's this, Anders?" he had asked, gesturing with his thumb. building a trough for the spring melt. That gap will fill with water, freeze solid, and split your walls apart like a wedge in an oak log. You're building an ice engine that will destroy your own house." Anders simply nodded, his face smudged with clay. "Perhaps," he said, "we will see come January." The twin walls rose to just above the ground level. At that point, he capped the 18-inch air gap with massive flat stones, sealing it completely. From the ground up, he began to build a conventional log cabin, but its base was now resting on this massive, bizarre, and deeply buried stone fortress. The cabin itself was smaller than his neighbors' homes, a fact that drew further scorn. He was expending 10 times the effort for half the space. His final innovation was the floor. Instead of a drafty, suspended wood floor, Anders filled the interior of his foundation with another layer of gravel for drainage, then a foot of tamped earth, and finally a meticulously laid floor of flat flagstones he had hauled from a distant creek bed. The floor of his cabin was, in effect, a solid direct connection to the massive stone and earth structure beneath it. It was a single monolithic unit. The scientific principles at work in Anders Larsen's design were a combination of 3 critical concepts that were utterly foreign to the frontier builders of his time. He had, through intuition and observation, created a system of immense thermal efficiency. The first and most important principle was his use of the Earth itself as a thermal battery, a concept we now call geothermal stability. The surface of the Earth experiences wild temperature swings from over 100 degrees in summer to 40 below zero in winter. But this is a surface phenomenon. Go down 6 or 7 feet, and the temperature of the Earth remains remarkably constant, hovering around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. By sinking his foundation so far below the frost line, Anders was not fighting the minus 40-degree air. He was borrowing the 50-degree stability of the deep Earth. His foundation wasn't sitting in frozen ground. It was anchored in a zone of constant moderate temperature. The second principle was the one that Silas Croft and the others found so foolish, the 18-inch air gap. This was the shipwright's secret. They saw an empty space that would fill with water and ice. Anders saw a powerful insulator. We now call this a dead airspace, and it's the same principle behind a double-pane window or a modern thermos. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat. By trapping a thick layer of air between his cold outer wall, which was in contact with the Earth, and his warm inner wall, which was in contact with his living space, he created a thermal break. Heat from inside the cabin would have to radiate across that 18-inch gap to escape, a process far, far slower than direct conduction through a single, solid wall. Croft's prediction of it filling with water was nullified by the deep gravel drainage bed Anders had laid, which kept the base of the foundation dry. The sealed stone cap prevented any moisture from entering from above. It was a sealed, dry, and incredibly effective buffer zone. The third and final principle was that of thermal mass. His neighbors' cabins had almost no thermal mass. The log walls and thin wood floors could not store heat. As soon as the fire died down, the heat dissipated into the night. Anders's cabin, however, was a fortress of thermal mass. The tons of stone in his dual foundation walls and the thick, solid flagstone and earth floor acted like a physical battery for heat. Throughout the day, as the small stove burned, its heat didn't just warm the air, it soaked slowly into the stone floor and the inner foundation wall. This process was slow, but once those materials were warm, they held that heat for a very long time. When the fire died down at night, the floor and walls began to slowly radiate their stored warmth back into the living space, maintaining a stable temperature for hours on end. The cabin didn't just have a heater, the cabin was the heater. But in the autumn of 1886, these principles were unknown. All the community saw was a stubborn Norwegian immigrant wasting precious building time on an elaborate stone pit. The project earned a name, Larson's Folly. At the trading post, the men would lean against the counter and joke about it. Herd Anders is trying to dig his way back to Norway, one would say, to a round of laughter. He's not building a house, he's planting one, another would add. Maybe it'll sprout a warmer cabin next spring. The ridicule was not always good-natured. It was tinged with the anxiety of the frontier, a place where conformity was a survival strategy. Doing things the proven way was safe. Experimentation was dangerous, not just for the individual, but for the community that might have to support a failed homesteader through the winter. Anders's project was seen as an arrogant rejection of their collective wisdom. The most direct confrontation came from Silas Croft. He felt a sense of responsibility for the families in the valley, and he saw Anders's project as a disaster in the making. He rode out to the Larson claim one crisp October afternoon, determined to talk some sense into the man. He found Anders chinking the logs of the small cabin that sat atop the massive stone foundation. "Anders," Croft began, his tone more paternal than angry, "this has gone on long enough. You're a hard worker, no one denies that, but you're putting your family at risk. This design of yours, it goes against everything we know about building in this country." Anders stopped his work, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at the older man with his calm, blue eyes. "How so, Mr. Croft?" "The ground freezes, man," Croft said, his frustration rising. "It moves. It heaves. It will shatter those stone walls you've so carefully laid. And that gap you've built? It's a trap. It will fill with frost, with ice, and it will be colder than a simple crawl space. You're concentrating the cold right under your floor. You've built a root cellar, a fine one, but a terrible place to live. When the real cold comes, that stone floor will be the coldest thing in this valley. It will suck the life right out of you." Anders listened patiently, nodding at each point. Croft's logic was sound, based on decades of experience with conventional foundations. He was not being malicious. He was genuinely trying to help. "You're wasting good timber on a foolish experiment," Croft finished, his voice softening. "There's still time. Fill in that pit. We can have a proper floor and foundation on this cabin in a week." Anders looked at his finished work, at the small, sturdy cabin that seemed to grow organically from the earth. He thought of the deep, stable cold of the North Atlantic and the deep, stable warmth of the earth below the frost. "I thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft," Anders said, his voice even. "But the work is done. We will see what the winter brings." Croft stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in resignation. He climbed back onto his wagon, a man convinced he had just witnessed an act of profound, tragic stubbornness. He had done his duty. The rest was in God's hands. The social pressure weighed most heavily on Ilara, Anders's wife. She trusted her husband's skill. She had seen the ships he had helped build, marvels of strength and precision, but she was not a shipwright. She was a woman on the frontier, and the opinions of her neighbors mattered. The whispers and sideways glances at the trading post stung. The wives of the other farmers would ask her with feigned sympathy if they were planning to move into the root cellar for the winter. One evening, as the first sharp winds of November rattled the temporary shelter they were still living in, she finally voiced her fears. The baby, Carrie, was asleep, and the only sound was the wind and the crackle of their small fire. "Anders," she began, her voice quiet, "the Jensens are already laughing at us. They say we've buried our home before we've even lived in it." Anders looked up from the harness he was mending. Their laughter does not make the wind warmer, Ilara. But what if Mr. Croft is right? She pressed, her anxiety breaking through. He has built so many houses. He knows this land. What if the walls do crack? What if the floor is as cold as a gravestone? We have spent everything on this. We have no time to build another before the snows are deep. What will we do if it fails? Anders put down his work and went to her. He took her hands, which were rough from work but warm from the fire. He knows the surface of this land. Anders said softly, I have looked deeper. I do not ask you to believe in my design. I ask you to believe in me. I will not let you and Carrie be cold. I promise you this. His certainty was a comfort, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. The entire valley was watching, waiting for them to fail, and winter was coming. The winter of 1887 arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an assault. It began in mid-December with a blizzard that buried the prairie under 3 feet of snow. But the snow was just the opening salvo. After the storm passed, the sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature plummeted. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer at the trading post did not rise above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. For a week, it hovered at 20 below. Then came the Great Freeze. A wave of Arctic air descended from the north, and for 72 hours, the valley was locked in a state of siege. The official temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The relentless prairie wind, blowing at a steady 30 miles per hour, created a wind chill that defied measurement and sanity, estimated by the Territorial Army post to be colder than minus 70 degrees. It was a cold that was not just a lack of heat, but an active, aggressive force. It turned exposed skin black in minutes. It made iron as brittle as glass. It was a cold that killed. Inside the valley's conventional cabins, life ground to a halt and became a singular battle for survival. The Jensen family, in their brand-new, well-chinked cabin, burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate. The stove glowed a dull red, yet the air in the room was so cold that a dipper of water left on the table froze solid in under an hour. Frost, thick and white as a sheep's fleece, crept a foot up the inside of the walls. The children huddled together under a mountain of blankets, their breathing shallow and weak. In Silas Croft's own home, the model of frontier construction, the situation was little better. Despite his vast woodpile, he was forced to keep the stove door open, feeding it logs every 15 minutes. The heat blasted out a few feet, creating a small, survivable radius, but the corners of the room were a frigid 25 degrees. His wife had to move all their preserved food from the pantry into the main room to keep it from freezing and bursting the jars. The wind howled through infinitesimal cracks, a constant mocking whistle. They were surviving, but it was a miserable, exhausting, and precarious existence. Their world had shrunk to the few square feet around a ravenous iron box. Before I tell you what was happening inside the Larson cabin during the Great Freeze, I want to ask you to take a moment and reflect. In the comments below, tell us the coldest temperature you've ever personally experienced. What did it feel like? Then, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion to this incredible story. During the height of the Great Freeze, desperation drove one of the Larsons' neighbors, a young farmer named Thomas, to their door. His wife was sick, and his supply of dry firewood was nearly gone. He was burning twisted slough grass and green poplar, which gave off more smoke than heat. He trudged through the deep, squeaking snow, the air so cold it burned his lungs, expecting to find the Larsons in a state even worse than his own. He hammered on their door, his mittened hand making a dull thud. The door opened, and Anders Larsen stood there, silhouetted by warm, yellow light. The first thing that struck Thomas was that Anders was wearing a simple wool shirt and trousers, no coat, no hat. The second thing was the air that washed over him from inside the cabin. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, nor the smoky haze of green wood. It was a gentle, steady, uniform warmth. It was the air of a pleasant autumn day. Anders invited him in. Thomas stumbled into the small room, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ilara was sitting at the table sewing. She wore a simple dress. On the flagstone floor, little Kari, who should have been bundled to the point of immobility, was crawling on a small rug, playing with a wooden block. She was in her shirt sleeves. The stove was burning, but with a low, gentle fire, the damper turned almost completely closed. There was no frost on the walls, none. The single window had a delicate tracery of ice at the very edges, but the center was clear glass. "My God, Anders," Thomas whispered, peeling off his frozen mask and mittens. The feeling returning to his fingers was agonizing, but the warmth of the room was a miracle. He looked at the floor, the stone floor that Silas Croft had sworn would be like an ice sheet. He knelt down and placed his bare palm on it. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was cool, like the earth in a shady spot in summer. It wasn't stealing his heat. "How?" Thomas asked, looking from the comfortable family to the placid stove. "What sorcery is this?" Anders simply smiled and gestured for him to sit near the fire. He had not built a cabin, he had built an ark. While the rest of the valley was battling the storm, the Larsen family was simply floating through it, safe and warm within their fortress of earth and air. Word of what Thomas had seen at the Larsen place spread through the valley like wildfire, carried by desperation and disbelief. At first, no one believed it. It was chalked up to the delirium of a freezing man, but the story persisted. He described the calm, the warmth, the child playing on the floor. He described a man in his shirt sleeves while the world outside was frozen solid. The story reached Silas Croft, who was nursing his pride and his dwindling woodpile. Croft was a proud man, but he was also a man of deep-seated integrity. He was a master builder, and the idea that he had been so fundamentally wrong was a bitter pill to swallow. But the possibility that a family might be suffering in a failed experiment of a house, or conversely, that a secret to true winter survival had been discovered, compelled him to act. He would not rely on third-hand accounts. He would see for himself. He took his most prized possession, a mercury thermometer from Germany, cased in brass and calibrated for accuracy, and set out for Larsen's Folly. He arrived on the third day of the Great Freeze. The air was still and brutally cold. He stood outside the Larsen cabin for a moment, letting the thermometer acclimate. It settled on a reading that made him shiver, though he was bundled in buffalo hide, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees below zero. He recorded the number in a small notebook with a frozen pencil. Then he knocked. Anders opened the door, and once again the gentle wave of steady warmth washed out. Croft, a man who had spent 60 years in the cold, recognized it instantly. It was not the oppressive heat of a stove. It was the ambient warmth of a well-built space. He stepped inside, his skepticism warring with the immediate, undeniable evidence of his senses. The air was fresh and still. The temperature felt to be, he guessed, in the high 60s. "Anders," Croft said, his voice gruff, "the boy Thomas is telling stories. I've come to see the truth of it." He held up the thermometer. "With your permission." Anders nodded. "Please, Mr. Croft, measure what you will." Croft hung the thermometer on a nail in the center of the room, away from the stove and the door. He and Anders stood in silence for 10 minutes as the mercury slowly climbed. Ilara continued her mending. The baby gurgled on the floor. Finally, Croft stepped forward and peered at the instrument. The red line stood crisp and clear on 68 degrees, a 100-degree difference from the outside, 68 degrees. He was stunned. In his own cabin, which was larger, he could only achieve 45 degrees near the stove, with the temperature dropping to near freezing in the corners. This small room was a uniform, comfortable 68 degrees. He took the thermometer and placed it on the floor, directly on the flagstones. He waited again. The mercury dropped, but only to 56 degrees. The floor that should have been sucking the heat out of the room was warmer than the deep earth itself. It was radiating stored heat, 56 degrees. He measured the wall a foot away from the stove, 64 degrees. He measured the wall farthest from the stove, 62 degrees. The temperature was astonishingly uniform. Finally, he turned to Anders, his face a mixture of awe and profound confusion. "Your woodpile," Croft said. It was not a question, but a demand. Anders led him outside. Next to the cabin was a neatly stacked rick of firewood, the same size as those of his neighbors, but where their piles had been decimated, reduced to a fraction of their autumn size, Anders's pile was barely touched. He had used perhaps 1/5 of the wood that Croft had burned through. The data was simple, stark, and irrefutable. 1/5 the fuel for a temperature 20 degrees warmer and infinitely more stable. Croft stood there for a long time, looking from the massive woodpile to the small, unassuming cabin. He looked at the deep snow covering the ground where he knew the massive foundation lay buried. He thought of the 18-inch air gap he had mocked, the deep drainage he had dismissed, and the stone floor he had condemned. He had analyzed the components correctly based on his experience, but he had failed to understand the system. He had seen a collection of mistakes, while Anders had built a machine. He turned to face the quiet Norwegian. The wind whipped at their coats, and the cold was a physical pain. Croft pulled down his scarf, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked Anders Larsen directly in the eye, and the master builder of the valley, the respected voice of tradition, delivered his concession. "I was wrong," Croft said, the words torn from him by the wind and his own shattered pride. Simply, completely wrong. He paused, the weight of the moment settling between them. He looked back at the warm glow in the cabin window, a beacon of impossible comfort in the frozen wasteland. "This works," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. "Teach me how." That conversation, held in the soul-crushing cold of -32 degrees, marked a turning point for the entire valley. When the great freeze finally broke, and tales of the Larsen cabin's impossible warmth were confirmed by the unimpeachable testimony of Silas Croft himself, the ridicule turned to awe. Larsen's folly was a name no longer spoken. Instead, people began to speak of the Larsen Foundation. That spring, 2 families who were planning to build new homes did not go to Silas Croft first. They went to Anders Larsen. They asked him to oversee the digging of their foundations, to show them how to lay the double walls of stone and seal the vital air gap. Croft, far from being resentful, joined them. Humbled and endlessly curious, he worked alongside Anders, learning the principles he had once so confidently dismissed. He brought his lifetime of building experience, suggesting improvements to the framing and roofing that complemented Anders's thermal design. It was a fusion of new and old, of radical principle and traditional craft. Over the next decade, the Larsen Foundation became the new standard for construction in the valley, and the surrounding territories. No new cabin was built without that deep footing, the double wall, and the thermal mass floor. The impact on the community was profound and multifaceted. The most immediate benefit was the dramatic improvement in health and safety. With homes that were consistently warm and free of drafts, rates of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other winter ailments plummeted, especially among children and the elderly. The economic impact was just as significant. The demand for firewood was cut by more than half across the community. This freed up hundreds, then thousands of man-hours. Men who had once spent their entire autumns cutting wood could now spend that time clearing more land, building better barns, improving their livestock, and preparing for the next planting season. The valley became more prosperous, more resilient. The tyranny of the stove was broken. Winter was transformed from a 6-month siege into a season of rest and recovery. The quality of life, the simple human dignity of being warm in one's own home, was elevated to a level no one had thought possible. The principles that Anders Larsen intuitively applied on that frozen prairie are not relics of the past. They are, in fact, more relevant today than ever before. His deep foundation, which tapped into the stable temperature of the earth, is the core concept behind modern geothermal heating and cooling systems. His buried stone walls and flagstone floor were a brilliant, if unintentional, form of what we now call an earth-sheltered home, using the immense thermal mass of the planet itself to regulate indoor temperatures. The feature that his neighbors found most absurd, the 18-inch air gap between two stone walls, is a direct ancestor to several high-performance building techniques. It functioned as a super-insulated double-stud wall, creating a massive thermal break. It also served the function of a modern rain screen, allowing any moisture that got into the assembly to drain away harmlessly at the gravel base, keeping the main structure dry and free of rot or frost. What Anders built was not just a cabin, it was a high-performance thermal envelope, a passive house born of necessity and observation a century before the term was ever coined. The story of Anders Larsen and his buried cabin is more than a historical anecdote about construction. It is a powerful lesson about the nature of innovation and the sociology of knowledge. It teaches us that true expertise is not always held by the established authority. Sometimes it is the outsider, the person with a different background and a fresh set of eyes, the shipwright on the prairie who can see the solution that everyone else has missed. It is a testament to the power of quiet observation, of questioning convention not with loud arguments, but with diligent work and measurable results. And it is also a story about the humility required for progress. Silas Croft's greatness was not just in his skill as a builder, but in his integrity to admit he was wrong when faced with undeniable data-backed evidence. His willingness to abandon a lifetime of certainty in the face of a better method is what allowed the innovation to spread and benefit the entire community. It is a reminder that ego is a greater obstacle to progress than ignorance. The ultimate vindication of practical wisdom comes not from the humiliation of those who were wrong, but from the willing adoption of a better way for the betterment of all. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found the story of Anders Larsen's ingenuity inspiring, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into forgotten history. We have many more stories to tell. Now, for our final question, if you had the land and the resources, would you consider building a home based on these earth-sheltered principles? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Our next video will explore the lost art of the cooper and how the humble wooden barrel was the logistical key that unlocked global trade. You won't want to miss it. Disclaimer: The story, characters, and specific events depicted in this video are fictionalized for narrative and educational purposes. The building techniques described are based on historical and scientific principles, but should not be attempted without consulting modern professional engineers, architects, and local building codes. Construction, especially excavation and masonry, carries inherent risks. This content is for entertainment and informational purposes only and does not constitute professional advice. Always prioritize safety and adhere to all current laws and regulations in any construction project.